Welcome everyone, whether it's good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Jack Walton. This is the first of a series of three Cradle webinars on new directions in AI research and practice with a focus on higher education. And today we're here to talk about student perspectives on AI, particularly in relation to a really large project on that topic that I've been lucky to be involved with alongside our wonderful panelists. I want to begin, as always, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the unceded lands, skies, and waterways on which we come together, and really to pay a deep respect to the ancestors and elders, past, present, and emerging of Wadawurrung country, Eastern Ma country, and Wurundjeri country, which is where Deacon's campuses are located. And of course, we are in online mode today, it being a webinar. So I really want to offer you the opportunity to acknowledge the country that you're joining us from. I'm joining from Yagara Turrbal country myself today. So you're welcome to use the chat, as I can see some of you are doing, to let us know where it is you're joining from. It is certainly my very great privilege to chair a session today with four really amazing panelists. From the University of Queensland, we have Professor Kelly Matthews. From Monash University, Professor Michael Henderson and Associate Professor Tim Fawns. And from the University of Technology, Sydney, Associate Professor Nicole Pepperell. And I also absolutely want to acknowledge Professor Margaret Bierman and Dr. Paige Marnie, who are doing the all-important duty of watching over the chat and keeping an eye on the technical side of the webinar and have already been performing unbelievably in that role as we get the webinar set up today. We're here to talk about student perspectives on AI in higher education. And I think what makes this panel especially cool is that Kelly, Michael, Tim, and Nicole are all key players in a very large project that you might have heard of. It's aptly called the Student Perspectives on AI in Higher Education project, which is a collaboration between UQ, Monash, Deakin, and UTS that started in 2024. And this project's really aimed at honoring the student voice, which is, I think, just so easily drowned out in what is a very loud and sometimes very brash conversation when it comes to AI and all of the wonderful hot topics that intersect with it. So I'm really fortunate to count myself part of that project as well. Before we get to the fun stuff, I have to do just a little bit of housekeeping, and that's to let you know that to register a question for the panel, please do use the Q&A feature in Zoom rather than posting in the chat. You can use the chat, but we'll be prioritizing the Q&A. And remember that you can upvote the questions that you like the best, and then we'll go to those questions in order of votes throughout the panel. And I'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A as things unfold. The way that this is going to work is that I'm going to borrow just a couple of minutes at the start here to set the scene for the conversation. That's just to give you a little bit of context around the student perspectives on AI project, what it's about, some of the ideas that shape the way that we think about AI in that work, which are quite important, I think, and just a tiny little smidge of what we're finding and where we're headed next in the project. And then I'm going to hand it over to our panel and we're going to move very quickly into Q&A powered conversation. That is really the goal for us today. So please don't be shy and do feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A box really as soon as you like, because we'll be drawing from those as we go. The other thing to let you know is that since we're in webinar form, the session's a little bit shorter than some Cradle seminars, and we're keeping it to 60 minutes. And as always, we're recording this session. So if something goes by really quick and you want to come back to it, you'll be able to, but we won't be saving or distributing the chat afterwards. So that's just something for you to keep in mind. Okay, so tiny bit of preamble from me. I've mentioned it already, but really the important premise for the Student Perspectives on AI project that we're going to be talking about has been to surface the student voice on AI in higher education. And we know this is a conversation that's often dominated by a focus on academic integrity and assessment, and those are really important topics, and we're actually going to be setting aside space specifically for those in more detail in the third webinar in this series in in a couple of months. This project, though, was really motivated by a concern for the assumptions that are made about students themselves. Not just how students use AI as part of their studies, but how they identify and make sense of learning in a time where AI is commonplace. And how they get to have a voice, all importantly, how they get to have a voice in what happens as higher education changes in response to the technology. And so to get down to that deeper level, and this is kind of just a tiny theory moment, this project shifts the focus from Gen AI use to Gen AI interactions, where the interest is less on what students do with the technology than what it is students and the technology actually do together. So while a student might say to us that they, let's say, use ChatGPT maybe to summarize text or to generate ideas, to answer a quiz, whatever it might be, in this project, we're understanding those outputs and their effects on learning as co-productions between students and AI, both of whom bring something to the equation of what is produced. And of course, these interactions don't happen in an isolated way. They happen in particular times, in particular places. It might be in the library the night before the assignment is due, maybe the kitchen table while the kids are asleep. So here we're really thinking about interactions with AI as co-constructed with all the facets of higher education, course materials, study environments, friends, lecturers, and even memories of past experiences. And so last year, the project surveyed more than 8,000 students across UQ, Monash, Deakin, and UTS, and spoke with 79 students from across those universities in focus groups. And we learned that yes, most students surveyed report using AI in their learning, but far fewer felt they received advice about using AI to study and to move toward a future career where AI would be commonplace. And I think while these simple numbers are obviously compelling when they're presented up on the screen like this, what we saw when we looked at the data in closer detail is that actually students' views on AI turn out to be really, really complex. They're really diverse, but they aren't necessarily always clear or coherent. And we saw mixed messaging sometimes from the institutional side and mixed emotions from the students themselves about their own use of AI, whether it was right or wrong, whether they might feel guilty or relieved or other feelings. And we saw the difficulty that presents itself in articulating a relationship with AI, the difficulty of finding just the right metaphor to capture what it is to interact with AI in a holistic sense. And I think we see a really good illustration of how this complexity plays out in the latest publication from the project, which focused in on feedback. And we saw that those students who did report sourcing feedback from both AI and their teachers, while teachers were seen overall to be more helpful and to be more trustworthy, that certainly doesn't mean to say that AI was thought of poorly. And so one of the really interesting conclusions to come from this part of the work is that Gen AI and teacher feedback might have complementary but not interchangeable functions. And to bring the point home, the differences seem to be a mix of practical and emotional kinds. Students described AI feedback as timely, responsive, understandable. Teacher feedback, on the other hand, was seen to be more reliable, contextualized, and personal, but potentially more risky as well. The important detail here, though, is that both had merit. And this is, of course, a very simplified representation. So I'd encourage you to seek out the paper, to visit the website if you're interested in the nuance. But it's in delving into this kind of complexity that the project is really looking to honor the student perspective in guiding action that takes place in the sector. And so in 2025, building on that first phase of data collection, the project is really starting to look toward constructing actionable guidance and doing that through a process of co-design with students, with educators, with industry professionals, looking toward principles for working with AI as part of a normal higher education experience. And so that brings me to the end of this quick framing. I can see a couple of comments rattling through about access to the article. We can pass that along after the webinar has finised. I'm conscious that that was a quick fly through, but we really want to get to the conversation. So that at this point, I'm going to put away the screen sharing, and I'm going to bring on my screen our lovely panelists back into my view, where I'm managing many windows at once. And to, oh, we have a microphone going somewhere. To get things going, Kelly, I want to go to you first. I think for what is a kind of first steps kind of question. And so this is a project about student voice. On one of the slides we saw earlier, there was a comment about this problem of making assumptions about what students are doing or what they might be doing with AI, why they're doing it, or perhaps even how they feel about it. And I'm wondering if you can get us started with some comments about why this is important, what assumptions we might be making, and what we might be missing or risking in the process of assumption making.
Thanks, Jack. First, hello to everyone. It's great to see so many people from all around the world on the chat. And if everyone thinks back to kind of a couple of years ago, ChatGPT just kind of comes out. What were the key assumptions then coming out about how students would use ChatGPT? Just the first thing that comes to your mind, just drop it into the chat. Assumptions about how students would be using AI. Cheating. There was no doubt. Copy pasters, efficiency, shortcuts. So coming into this conversation, it really did arise from this discussion between some of us in this group thinking about, we know it's not that simple. We know that this can't be the only way that students are using this. And frankly, concerned about what it means when we are talking about students instead of talking with students. So this opportunity to come and say, let's actually try to find out by listening to students. So we started with focus groups. And we were really curious around our 4 universities if we would see differences by institution as well. So talking to students, it made it clear so quickly that they were grappling with AI in a lot of the same ways that staff grappling with AI, navigating it, the uncertainty that it was causing, the hype around it. So through those focus groups, we could see that there was more variation within institutions than necessarily across the institutions. So when we moved to the survey design, it was really the opportunity there to get a much bigger sample of students to try to look at this. And I will say, Tim and I in particular have spent a lot of time thinking about just how complex and how thoughtfully students are talking about and thinking about and navigating AI. And even in the focus groups, how they disagreed with each other, how they hold kind of stances in spaces, but their willingness there to actually change their point of view when they listen to ways other students explained or discussed why or why not they wanted to engage with AI in their learning.
Thanks, Kelly. And I immediately have another question to follow up with, but I just wanted to throw it to the other panelists. Is there anything that anyone else wanted to chime in there on before I take the conversation off in another direction?
I think it's really important. But I love the fact you started with that question, Kelly, because I haven't seen that done before, but it is such a strong response, isn't it? Where everyone just goes, yeah, actually one of the very first conversations that we saw that just went right through every institution was this concern over the validity of work and what does this work mean? And is it cheating? Is it not? Is it? And it's interesting, in our survey work of 8,500 students from this project, we did notice that 40% did say that they have used it in some way. Most of them only in a small bit, others a lot more for assessment when they weren't supposed to. But our data also shows, and it's what I think you're getting to, is that the students were getting conflicted about the messaging from the institutions about what it was appropriate and not appropriate. So on one hand, it looks like it's not appropriate, but actually the way that they're using it, they're seeing actually this is still have some sort of integrity. It's a confusing space. And that's something that we're seeing in the survey and the interview data, that students are confused. But the important thing is also, I reckon, is to look at all of our other data that's showing what they are using it for that's not that, not relating to that integrity issue. So for instance, 67% of them said out of that 8,500 that they were editing and improving their work, that they were 60% were generating ideas, and 50% were using it to teach them things that they didn't know, like how to do something. Oh, that's pretty cool. And there's a lot of this kind of positive use of AI that have sort of we lose that story in this rush to worry about this concern.
Can I jump in, Jack? At the risk of you never getting back to your next question, another way of nuancing this discussion is that students might have said that they used AI when they were not supposed to, according to a rule, but they didn't use it necessarily to cheat. So they may have used it to do something that they felt didn't breach academic integrity, other than that they had been asked not to use AI. So they might have used it in ways that they felt enriched the learning, enriched the way that they engaged with the course and the assessment. It's just that they were not technically supposed to use it. So there's a distinction between cheating in the sense of using AI to take a shortcut and gain advantage, or not cheating but technically breaching a rule. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that.
And I'll just circle back to that, because a big part that came out of this too, and Michael, it came out in the survey data as well as the focus groups, that threat for students though, the amount of myths that we heard. Universities have AI detectors, they have arrangements with some AI companies. So that threat for many students was so real, and just the risk alone was enough to keep some students away from wanting to engage at all with AI.
I wonder if that might be a nice point for me to actually dip straight into the Q&A. And Nicole, I'm going to send to you on this question, because I know from our previous conversations that you might have a view here that I think this connects in really nicely with what we've just been talking about. And Colin Simpson has asked, if it hasn't already been covered, Colin's been reading about a 7,000 plus student petition at UNSW calling for the banning of a Gen AI art unit, and also the mandated use of Gen AI for eco and ethical reasons. And I know, Nicole, you have an interest in it. I think, we'd be remiss not to be across the topic of conscientious objection when it comes to using Gen AI. I wonder if you want to comment in response to that.
Yeah. Look, this is something that we did not prompt on in a direct way in the survey, but a number of students, in response to other questions, volunteered information. It was by no means, it wasn't huge, but there was a recurrent theme in some students of worrying about the ethical implications of using the technology at all. And where this is particularly challenging, I think, for the sector in Australia, is that TEXA is setting the kind of signal for where its regulatory approach is going to be. Its expectations on universities doesn't just say, well, how can you have confidence in student learning? It also says that universities have an affirmative obligation to prepare students to be able to use these tools in a social and professional world increasingly permeated by them. And that creates, I think, a particular challenge for students and staff who may be conscientious objectors to the technology. And there were a number of things that students who did phrase objections highlighted. Some of them were sort of social and economic consequences. Am I going to have a job, if this technology becomes pervasive? Some of them were environmental objections. Some of them were objections to the way the technology was trained. But these things did come up in the data. It's not a majority, but it is a challenge for us for how we're going to respond. I think it's something that we need to think about very carefully.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to go straight back to the Q&A, because Lincoln James has asked a question that I think is complementary to this. And Lincoln has asked, given we're going to be thinking about this a lot soon, what does the current research, or the research that this team is doing, indicate about how we can still assure student learning? So I'm conscious this is the flip side of what you were just talking about, Nicole. But also to support students to engage with Gen AI in ethical, open and appropriate ways. So do you want to extend your comments at all in relation to Lincoln's question?
Sure. I mean, I don't want to dominate the answers on this because I think every university's got projects and all of us are involved. I've involved in a process at UTS where we're reviewing and working with every teaching team across the university to think about how to do this at a sort of a program level. And that is in recognition that the way you need to do this is going to actually be quite discipline specific. There's some rules of thumb, and I can talk if people want to about UTS's rules of thumb on it. But I think in working with teaching teams, what's been interesting is that the assurance of learning bit has proven more intuitive. It doesn't necessarily mean that people think it's an easy problem to tackle, but in the question that Kelly asked at the beginning, you know, what was your first worry? And there's a sort of a big line of people saying cheating, 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 cheating. Teaching staff have been thinking about how to wrestle with the assurance of learning, the academic integrity issues from quite early. Where I'm running into more uncertainties, more anxieties from staff have been in the space of, do I need to be an expert somehow on this? Aren't my students going to know more about it than I do? How can I possibly be ready to teach people, particularly in such a dynamic space? And I have actually found the survey data useful here. In sharing with teaching staff that students have many of the same anxieties. They themselves may not have the confidence. They themselves may be worried that other people know more about it, or that the space is changing so quickly that what they learn will be out of date. So sort of trying to communicate that student and staff anxieties are diverse, and we're not necessarily that far apart. And therefore, there's some cause for collaborating about how we're going to respond on this.
Mm.
You said so many wonderful things in there, Nicole, that we could just dive straight into. Kelly, I could see you nodding along. I just wondered if you had any comments to follow up on that.
Oh, look, I think as Nicole was talking, one of the risks that I see potentially happening is we get so discipline specific that we actually lose the need for interdisciplinary conversations around AI. Different disciplines will have different beliefs about knowledge, the way they'll think about assessment, and how they need to teach AI. But actually bringing together academics and students from across disciplines has been really rich because it opens up ways of thinking in ways that people hadn't. So for example, at my institution, some of my colleagues in creative writing have been talking about the environmental impact, and my other colleagues in physiology are like, I didn't even realize that that was a thing. So this way of saying we need to learn together and create the space to think about responsible use, ethics, integrity, learning, is how do we bring students and staff together and create the space where they can start to see that we're all swimming in the same water here, if you will. And that's part of the reason we moved to the co-design in phase 2 of this, was to bring together students and staff to start to have those types of conversations.
Thanks, Kelly. And I'm going to definitely send to Tim now because you mentioned making space. And I know, Tim, there's a topic that you have a lot of time and energy for. I also want to recognize in the Q&A that this is actually very in sync with, I think it's Katie, if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, a question that Katie has asked, which is around division of opinion, polarization towards AI amongst teachers, and how we might foster constructive dialogue with both sides of the debate. So, Tim, this feels like a great time to segue.
It is. Yeah, thank you, Jack. So one of the things that came out of the focus groups is that there's so many different views on what learning is and what matters. So I think before we can just say, let's make sure we assure learning, we have to think about what kinds of learning are we wanting to assure. And an obstacle for us is that there are quite profound differences in how people understand the types of learning that need to be targeted and how to support them. So you can think about targeting sort of internal knowledge. You can think about targeting neurological development, a biological view of learning. You can think about trying to secure a collective type of learning where people are using technologies and working with other people. And so it's really difficult when we're talking about how to assure learning to reconcile quite divergent views on learning that came out from the students that we were talking to, and I know from conversations also divergent views of staff. So we were going to move more slowly towards this point, but the idea, as Kelly said, of the co-design, the co-labs, is to create a space for students and staff to talk together about these issues. And I think that's one of the things that's come out of this project for me, is the importance of navigating this and negotiating paths forward with students, with educators, with people in industry, with people outside of these groups, to try and work out what kinds of things matter and how might we find a path that helps us navigate something that makes sense for different contexts.
Thanks, Tim. I'm watching the Q&A, and you're talking about learning there, and so I want to ask you more about assurance of learning, because I think one of the interesting things that's coming out here is that the subject of assurance of learning already, between your comments, Nicole, Kelly, and Tim, we're seeing different dimensions to that. You referred to it as intuitive earlier, Nicole. Tim, you're asking what kinds of learning. I think on the subject of learning and doing the dance with the Q&A, I'm going to go to Michael now, because I know, Michael, you're the learning design guy in our group. Your eyebrows going up, going, what? I didn't realize I was going to be put
I'll take that, but I'm not sure I can speak for everyone in this area. But go on.
But I think, you've been particularly heavily involved in the survey element of the work. I know you've been quite instrumental in some of what has been done in this project around feedback. And there is a question in the Q&A from Talia, which I think you might be well positioned to speak to, which is if we start to actively incorporate AI into our teaching, what are the implications for sustainability practices and targets? And I know that sustainability practices might be a sort of second part of this question. So I want to focus on the learning part first, and then we can circle back potentially to sustainability in its various dimensions. Thinking about learning and learning design, I know we have seen in the survey data, particularly around feedback and beyond, that students clearly are working with AI already using it as a source of feedback. How does that change the way that we might think about learning or education design, whether that's for feedback specifically or learning design in general? It seems we are trying to keep pace with a train that is already moving.
Yeah, I mean, to some respects, the horse has already bolted. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. And it's also not necessarily a new thing. Sometimes we forget actually that students are doing a lot of stuff that we don't see and we're not involved in. And there's sometimes some things that we should be involved in to help with equity and other sort of concerns that we, that get us up in the morning. So I think it's really interesting. We can talk about AI in terms of particularly generative AI, in terms of content and that kind of side of things of learning design. But for me, the herding cats moment, the bit that's really difficult, but also the bit that is both joyful and creative and really impactful, is thinking about those moments of interaction. And for me, I'm a card-carrying feedback person. For me, I often think of these interactions in terms of what makes a productive feedback moment. And I suppose what we can do is link it back to some of the data that you presented before, Jack. So first of all, let's clarify what I mean by feedback. So feedback is a student-centered thing, right? So feedback from my perspective is where students make sense of information about their performance to improve what they can do. So in that kind of definition, teachers don't fit, right? Teachers are secondary to that idea. So it's within the student. What can the students do? Our role becomes critical in going, how can we influence those inputs, the quality of that information about their work? How can we influence how the learners make sense of that information, how they can take action on that? How can we set up situations so that they can try out some of that feedback to see whether they've got it and they can improve? So that is the cool bit about learning design, that we stop thinking of us teaching, like instructing. That's why I don't use the word instructional design anymore. I use learning design or educational design. We are creating these experiences to stimulate these moments of growth. So we think about that side of things. And feedback's also really relational, right? It has such a motivational impact. It impacts resilience, impacts rapport, all these things about experience. So it's deeply human in that respect. And so when we think about AI and feedback, we know, for instance, the ed tech sector and higher ed in general is really interested in going, how can we create products and systems that will bring AI into the teaching learning kind of dialogue? And that includes feedback. I'm a bit concerned about it, but what we do know, of course, is, as you said, the horse is already bolted, the students are already using it. 80% of those 8,500 students that we asked about AI use it for study, and half of those use it for feedback. Of the half that did not use it for feedback, 28% of them said they didn't even realize that you could use it for feedback. So there was this kind of thing of going, it's interesting that we did explain what we understood by feedbacks. And when they're talking about feedback, they are saying they're doing it to find out information about the work. It's not them getting it to do their work. So clearly students want feedback. They're actively looking for feedback, and that's pretty cool, because we often talk about feedback literacy, as in we want students to be agentic and engaging it. So they're doing it. So really for us, and coming back to the question that you threw at me, Jack, is what do we do about this? Well, I think the first thing we realize is they're doing stuff already, so we have to urgently figure out where can we productively and usefully insert ourselves in that conversation that's already going on. So when students are reaching out to AI to get feedback, how do we help them understand what is particularly trustworthy, what's particularly useful, and what's not? And how do we understand how they're using teacher feedback and what is really useful and helpful there? And when do those things connect? The survey work that we've done, the interview work that we've done so far basically tells us the shape of the thing, the kinds of things that's motivating them, of why they're doing it and when they do it and how much they're doing it. But it's not telling us exactly what the impact is, or how the interactions between the AI-based feedback and the teacher-based feedback, how they're interacting and how they navigate that and what they do with it and what really has that impact. That's the next step for research for us, is to really understand that dynamic.
I love that, Michael. And I really like what you're talking about, that interaction. And it makes me think about the importance of conversations that educators, university academics are having with their students about these. And one of the things that really struck me through this process of listening to students and now the co-design labs is the emotional climate that's forming around AI, and just how visceral, how students are really feeling that experience in both ways that pull and push them. And I see Nicole nodding her head, because Nicole, you've been thinking about this too.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking while both of you were speaking about that sort of subset of the data, and this came up a little bit in the summary at the beginning of the webinar, about there's a risk involved in asking teachers for feedback. So the feedback from the teacher is valuable, but it might be a little scary. Or where do you go if you're a little bit uncertain? And the AI for some subset of students is a safer space for starting out, or for things that you feel like you need to catch up, or for things where you want something to break it down in simpler terms. The data suggests there's a use of that, but it also suggests a value to interactive, relational, and we've known, it's not new information, that relations are important for learning, for teaching, but I think it's particularly distilled in the sort of crucible of what AI is doing in the sector at the moment. And so this issue of what students are still wanting from that relational aspect and from having something from us, I think that's the thing that we still need digging into.
And I think, Tim, your analysis and thinking about it from an entangled pedagogy, it becomes much more than feedback as well, where those emotions are swirling and how students are making value judgments.
Yeah, so one of the things I was thinking as Nicole was talking is that there's also emotional risk involved in using Gen AI a lot of the time, because some students would use it. And there was a commenting or a question from Kay before about how sometimes students feel compelled to use Gen AI to try to keep up in a competitive world, even when they don't want to. And the kind of mixed messaging that Jack was talking about led some students to be really anxious about their use of Gen AI in potentially being caught and punished, but often would use it anyway. So there's this real kind of messy tension around the use of Gen AI. And as Kelly was saying, uses of Gen AI were not really straightforward. Like it wasn't really, I'm now going to use it to cheat, or I'm now going to use it to get feedback. The practices are quite complex. They're kind of becoming more and more integrated into patterns of study that are not just Gen AI or not Gen AI. It's sort of embedded. Sometimes students were worried that they were using it without knowing, because Gen AI is increasingly embedded in software, etc. And where, you know, universities are providing and requiring students to use learning management systems in which AI is becoming embedded, but at the same time telling students not to use it in some context. So it's a really, really messy space. And it's no wonder that students are kind of confused and that they feel like there's mixed messaging going on.
Hmm. Thanks, Tim. I might jump back into the Q&A because there's a couple of rippers in here and I want to make sure we get to it. One of the questions that I think is really interesting and disappeared from the open to the answered section of the Q&A, and I want to make sure we honor it because it had a lot of upvotes, was from James Neal. James has asked us a pointy question, which is why are there no students on this panel for a project on student voice? I'll leave that one open to the group.
Oh, look, I'm happy to have the first go. And I loved in the beginning, Jack, you said there's a tiny theory moment. James, your question is well received. I'm a student voice scholar, and from a scholarly perspective, I do not think of survey data as student voice, but in a practical sense, lots of people do here. So I've kind of learned to wave with the kind of context here. What I will say is, when I was hearing so much initial talk about the way students would engage with AI and the ways that they were being talked about, my mind observed that I don't think me bringing a couple of students and saying, hey, let's talk with these students would carry the same weight. Right or wrong, universities, mine included, we like data. We've got a lot of students, and what always seems to come up is this tension between, well, here are some students. I've invited so many students to panels, and then somebody says, well, you're not like a normal student. You're just an unusual student. But what about all the other students? And then students get put in this awkward place that talking for themselves is no longer enough. So putting students on panels get quite the dynamic. However, going back to this, I was happy to sit with that tension because I felt like we actually needed to understand in a broad sense, and I wanted to take a look at it that way. And then doing that and understanding it, I do feel though right now, James, that the sector is more ready and at institutions to be having these complex conversations, bringing together students and staff and members of industry that fit with the context there. So that point is well taken. Tim and I came up with the idea of student-splaining the other day, and we could absolutely be at risk of that, couldn't we, Tim?
Yes, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's worth asking us to talk through it. I think what we did in 2024 was to canvass a whole lot of sort of student perspectives at a certain level. And in 2025, as we move into the collabs, what we're trying to do is bring students more and more into shaping the research and the direction of it. I guess I'm trying to answer this question without sort of defending our position, but just thinking through it. And I think Kelly's right that what we're doing here is trying to articulate what we found last year. And hopefully, if we're invited back next year, we'll be in a better position to bring students into this conversation, having done those collabs. But the student-splaining thing is really interesting because we were reflecting on how academic staff, in which we include ourselves, we quite like to explain to students what students do and what students think and how students react. And it's interesting that staff, even sometimes in our collabs this happened, I think we got better over time, but that sometimes staff would explain to students what students do when there was a really good opportunity to just listen to those students. and ask them what they thought. But the problem of representation is really interesting. What does it mean to have one student on a panel? So I don't know. I'm talking to myself in circles, and I'm happy for another panelist to lead me out of this pit. But it's a really good question to ask us to talk through, I think.
And I think Michael has always brought this, and it's one of the things I really like. Michael, at the beginning of the project, also challenged why we were focusing on students and not teaching staff as well. And I thought really valid. Michael's always there reminding us that there's so many parts to this egg that we've unscrambled that the horse is bolted on.
Thanks, Kelly. I was going to say, Nicole, this is reminding me of conversations we've had in the past about the points of resonance between students and stuff, and how that might be something that we see in the story that comes together around AI and in navigating how we might actually do good with this type of research. Did you have a comment to that effect?
Yeah, I mean, there's also a sort of a side conversation going on in chat that's a little bit related to this. I'm not trying to jump out of the Q&A framework. One of the things that I've spent some time recently, both with my own students and with staff that I'm working with at UTS, is how do you have conversations with students about AI? Because with staff, if I talk to people, they say, oh, yes, we're having those conversations. But if you start unpacking it, the conversation may just be the staff member saying, I don't want you doing this with it, and it's okay if you do this with it. But what I mean by conversations is a discussion about how we learn and how certain kinds of struggle and difficulty are intrinsic to a learning process. And therefore, if we're advising as teachers, students not to use AI in particular ways, it's not because we're like the TV version of a librarian going around and shushing everybody or shaking our finger at them. We're giving them advice based on an understanding of the kind of friction that is needed to actually learn something. And if AI is getting in the way of that friction, it's probably getting in the way of learning. And so it's sort of not just the ethical issue, but the sort of goals that students are trying to achieve through university. So some of the anxieties that students express in the survey data are, is it going to rot my brain, from the recent, kind of headline? Am I becoming lazy? Am I becoming dependent? There is a resonance there. And I think it's helpful to talk about that resonance in non-moralizing terms. The students can use moralizing terms too in the survey data, but it's just kind of practically speaking, what do we know about what we need to learn? And learning is not, a smooth, plane of ice that we just glide along. If there's no friction, it's not happening. And if AI is getting rid of the friction, something's broken. And I think that's a kind of a point of resonance between student and staff anxieties that can inform a useful pedagogical discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. And I want to sort of just mention that we are also drifting, when I look at the Q&A here, into the territory of the questions that Michael Volkov and Phil Dawson are asking. And they're kind of both coming at this question of learning from different angles. Michael has asked something very similar to what you've just been commenting on, Nicole, which is not necessarily in terms of cheating or whether AI should be used or not, but what the panel might think about research coming out that suggests, AI could be causing a decrease in skill development in areas like critical thinking, problem solving, and so on. And from the opposite direction, Phil Dawson has asked us, what guidance we might give towards the conversation around assurance of learning and academic integrity and validity. I want to just put it open to the panel, really. Although Tim, I feel like this is leaning into your territory again. What comments
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Phil. I'm a frustrating person at times because it depends is usually the answer. And I like the idea that what we want to focus on is trying to understand what students are learning in relation to what we've said that they're learning in terms of the assurance context. But there are so many ways to go about that any sort of clear way of doing it needs to be contextualized. So if we learned anything from our study last year, for me it was that manifests what we get students to do, and how what we're trying to do in education. It manifests so differently depending on the student and the multiple identities that they're wrangling with, and the multiple purposes that they're bringing to their studies, and the disciplinary context and the level and the types of relationships that are forming in education. That if you to try and do this in one particular way, it won't work. It won't make sense. So one of the things I think we can't do is just create more clarity of rules or create more clarity of policy and solve the problem. I think those things are probably good things to try to do, but there needs to be more. We need to kind of negotiate it. And for that, I like the idea of creating a space, an educational space, where we can be quite open and potentially a bit more vulnerable than we might be used to, in terms of thinking, well, what kind of educational experiences and what kind of learning are important here and why, and that we might not go in with all the answers. We might need to develop the answers in collaboration with students. But that's probably not the conversation that techs are looking for when they want us to clarify how institutions are going to assure learning. But I think that's the position that I'm taking based on the focus group data, that it isn't easy to say in advance exactly what everybody should do, but that we have to try and figure it out together by reframing education as this kind of relational thing where different people have different things, different types of expertise. So students have expertise on themselves and the student experience and what they value. Educators do as well, and other people do. And so I see it as this kind of negotiation that can't really be predetermined. But I'm happy for others on the panel to disagree with this interpretation.
I'll jump in, not to disagree, but to go a little bit further on. I agree with the idea that further clarification of rules is something that we have to think about, but it's not going to fix all the issues. But I just want to unpick this a little bit, because sometimes when we talk about the fact that we understand that students through our research are saying they're getting confused. There's mixed messages for them, and they're not sure, and they're worried that they're going to get into trouble. Like 60% of our 8,000 odd students were saying that they were worried about breaking rules. But those same students weren't necessarily the same ones that were actually going ahead and breaking rules or anything. They're just going, I'm not sure what's going on here. So I think the thing is us going and saying, right, well, we're going to make even more explicit rules, and we're going to have sub points, and we're going to do, that's speaking to how we understand the world and what we think is clarity. But actually there's a degree of any kind of technology, any kind of practice. It's to do with identity and language and that lived kind of experience. And we need to be able to understand that we are talking very similar languages. And so we need to be involved in the use of AI with the students. So I'm going to put to one side for the moment the idea of objecting to using AI and whether it should or should not be part of the curriculum and things like that. But if we're going to clarify this stuff about rules, that the students understand when we say this is an appropriate use and that is not an appropriate use, or something like those lines, then we need to be in that conversation with the students so that it is clear that they understand what we're saying and we're understanding what they're saying about their use. So I just wanted to do that. It's more than us simply expanding our rules from 3 lines to 50 lines. There is something deeper. And I think that's coming back to what you're saying, Tim, about getting in and co-designing, understanding and getting into that dialogue with students. There's a real reason why we need to do it. If we look over the history of technologies as they've come through over the last 50 years in different waves of different types of technology, we often have these kinds of moments of moral panic, of reactions to these things. And it's not until they become part of practice, our cultural identity and ways of working and thinking, and that we're all having a similar experience, that we can now actually talk together about what we're doing. And at the moment, we're talking about things that we're not necessarily in, and students experiencing it in different ways that we are. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that's helped. And And so reflect back, it was a
Michael,
bit of a diatribe I was going on there. But anyway.
I wanna double click that though, Michael, because that there's, I think, really important. In policy land, sometimes we think we've written the policy and like magic is gonna happen. But the reality is understanding comes from being in the conversation. And one of the things that came out of the collabs and our initial look, students rated learning more, getting more insights than academics or members of industry. Students aren't being included in these conversations in the same way. So we have the space, many of us, to have this, yet for our students, lots of them haven't. So that opportunity in the classroom to take that and have a more honest dialogic conversation, I think, is absolutely spot on and the way to move forward with this. And I will say, in the larger data set, one of the ways we use that at UQ was to understand if there could be variation within our students, though. And that made us realize at UQ, we need to engage with our students with disabilities in co-design, but first we really need to listen to them. Because overall, the quantitative data showed they were having a different experience and it was challenging people's assumptions. So sometimes using that data to say there's places we need to dig in and we need to listen to groups of students and be more led by them and understand that too is also part of it. So it's us listening and creating that space to truly kind of listen and understand.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm mindful of the time. It's 8 minutes to the hour, which means we've really in practice got about 3 minutes for questions. There are so many good questions in the Q&A, far more than we can practically get to. What I want to do with our last couple of minutes is again throw to the panel as a whole for a very quick thought about where we're going and what not just what type of research we're doing, but what are the questions we're asking and what are the best problems worth solving, worth thinking about. Something that, I think we see when we look at the literature on AI in higher education. Obviously, that space has proliferated rapidly over the last couple of years. There is a sense that a lot of early studies were done that were tended to the speculative about how students might use AI, but we're now getting to a point, and the conversation has illustrated this, that we're starting to ask deeper, slightly reframed questions. And I want to put to you as a group, what are the directions that we should be headed here when we think about problematizing this space? A nice light question to wrap up the conversation.
I'm happy to have a first go at that. First of all, I want to identify a risk that I think is a real risk. And the risk is the conversations around AI become more and more divisive, and we're not able to find common ground moving forward. So that's one thing where I keep thinking within institutions, we've got to think about how we listen and understand and show that empathy and move in directions together. And I'll say from a research perspective, a lot of the research I've seen so far is around individual uses, what's happening in classrooms, what's happening with academics and teaching staff and policy and integrity. But I actually think there's an opportunity to really zoom out and understand how the logic of higher education, some of the drivers, will actually really shape and shift staff willingness to take pedagogical risks around AI or not, because some of the incentives and drivers for academics, particularly those in positions of precarity, how the logic will also drive students towards a more individualistic, competitive potential mindset, because that's how our assessment regimes are sort of set up in most higher education. So for me, I think it's time to zoom out and look at how some of those structures are actually shaping the ways that people are reacting to AI in higher education.
Thanks, Kelly. Tim, Michael, Nicole, any sort of 30-second ideas?
I'm
Yeah,
happy
Tim.
to go just so that I don't have to finish. So similar to Kelly, I was hoping you were going to talk about structures. I think the collabs that we've done so far, which have been these really rich conversations, 2-hour conversations 3 times with mostly the same people in each one on different themes in academic integrity, learning, and feedback. Just being in them showed the value of creating a space for conversations with staff and students. You could see staff saying, I just did not realize how students were actually thinking and feeling and acting. And the value of those conversations was really clear. I was in the integrity ones, and it was really interesting to see different people's views on what education is for shaping how they understood integrity. So integrity is this kind of relational concept in that lab about it relates to what we're trying to actually do here in education and how that shapes our priorities and what integrity means. And so I agree with Kelly that what it's leading us towards is zooming out. Are our structures of higher education kind of getting in the way of a lot of the things that people value and actually want to achieve and see as important for higher education? And also, how do we allow for multiplicity to be valued in education? Because people do not have the same, they're not coming from the same place. They're not living the same lives. They're not able to create a shared vision for a lot of different things. So how do we allow for that? I think is one of the questions we need to think about.
Michael and Nicole, we've got 4 minutes on the clock. Do you want to have a
Go, Nicole.
Okay. I'll be brief and then stick you with concluding things. It sort of builds on Tim, but picks up on some things from the comments too. There were comments both about students wanting clarity and rules, which students often ask us for, but also about staff building confidence. And these things are, again, one of these, they resonate between students and staff, although they're often not articulated together. I've been involved in other research projects over time about staff confidence and how people find confidence when they teach. And confidence often gets centered on total expertise. And so when you've got change, or when you're trying to encourage collaborative processes, that way of establishing your confidence in a classroom is more challenged than other bases of confidence. I'm interested in this question. I believe we need to move students across their university training to a period where they are more able to deal with uncertainty. I think that's what we're aiming for. We're after not a set of rules, not giving them clarity, but giving them the ability to deal with a lifetime of unclarity that they will be moving into, and giving them the ability to sort of do something with that. And in these moments where things are involuntarily unclear, even for teaching staff, I think there are some opportunities to reflect on student experience and our own pedagogies for this kind of space.
Thanks, Nicole. Michael, can you bring us home with a quick?
I'm going to actually point us in another direction, actually. I think everything that we've said today is really, really important, but I'm going to come back to something that Kelly outed me on before. I often am thinking about the teachers and what do they do and what the implication of that is to the students and also the teaching experience. But in this case, we often talk about integrity, but we're thinking straight about students. When you use the word integrity, I actually think about teachers' integrity. I actually think about integrity coming back to the Latin, the idea of the whole. How are we being faithful to the whole of education? What does the teacher do with AI, whether it's with the feedback or other interactions or content development or decision making? How do we represent that to the students? Because that has a big impact on their outcomes, their experience, their faith in us. So I want to think about that. I want to think about our role in that experience, in student experience. When I think about AI, I think of AIs, and I think that that as time progresses, we're going to have to get even more discreet in our language and understanding. We've largely been talking about generative AIs, okay, but actually we're seeing far more complex decision-making and process-orientated AIs that's automating kinds of things at institutional level, and they have an impact on students at mass level, right across the whole institution, whether it's by an edtech company or by the institution themselves implementing something. So I'm going to finish off my comment here by not reflecting on what I've said, but actually pointing us in another direction as well, and saying, let's think about the integrity of the teachers, of the institutions and AIs, and what that means for us as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Michael. And look, right on the minute, it's 2 p.m. here. That means we must draw the panel to a close. Please make a digital applause, which unfortunately we won't be able to hear, but we will appreciate for all of the panelists. Thank you so much for your time, for being here. All that remains for me is to plug the next webinar in this series, Assessment Design in Higher Education, Changing Practices for a World with AI. It'll be featuring Jason Lodge, Jess Lowe from the Education University of Hong Kong, Jan MacArthur from Lancaster University, and Nicole Pepperell for a return performance. And hopefully the link to that is in the chat. We will, of course, send out the recording once it's available. And so with that, thank you again for joining us. And we're looking forward to hopefully seeing you on the 17th for the next webinar in this series.